Okay, perfect. I'm going to be sharing my screen and giving a quick introduction here.
Sure. All right, it's on now. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining the MuleSoft Meetup, Atlanta virtual meetup. And today we have Linabel, who's part of the customer success team, and she will be presenting a topic on CICD for API managers. Linabel, over to you. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you for that introduction. Yeah, I'm excited to be here and sort of talk about the API manager and how we can actually automate this. Okay, so what I want to do is sort of give a quick introduction of why we might want to think about automating the API manager UI, as well as how we can incorporate this into our DevOps strategy. Then I'll go and talk about how to prepare for the development and what options are available for us, as well as how this looks like in an automation server. So thinking about automation server like Jenkins or GitLab, how would you need to configure that in order to have this as part of your DevOps strategy? And then I'll dive in deeper into what APIs are provided to us so that we can be able to automate for CICD. And finally, I'll end with a demo and leave room for questions at the end. I will pause in between some of these sections to see if there are any questions, as well as I will have a few pop quiz along the way just to make this more interactive. Okay, so before diving in, I just want to hear from you in the chat to see how are you currently creating and managing API instance? Is it A, are you using the API Manager UI to do that? Are you actually using API platforms? Or B, you're manually using the API platform, like calling the API through Postman or curl, or C, you actually automated this process already. So I just want to see, take a quick poll and see where everyone's at with this. Okay, so I see people are using the API manager. Oh, I see someone that's actually doing it manually through Postman. Okay, so A and B, I'm seeing a lot here. Perfect. Okay, so one of the biggest reasons why you might want to think about automating this process and going through CICD, it's because you do not have access to QA or prod. So right now, your business or company is saying, we don't want to give you access to QA or prod. These are, sensitive environments and only the operation team should have access. So the only solution you have now is actually incorporating this automation into your current CI/CD process, which right now you probably already have CI/CD for the deployments, but right now they want you to incorporate API Manager. So this would be one of the reasons for going through API Manager automation and through CI/CD. This means that we're going to have to think about a new DevOps strategy, right? Traditionally, or actually, there's a pop quiz here, so I want to give you guys room for this. But before I go and talk about the new DevOps strategy, I want to see if you guys can get this pop quiz correct here. So when you make an update to an API instance policy, so let's say you have an API instance, an API manager, you want to update the policy, a redeployment occurs in any point runtime. Is it A, true? Yes, a redeployment occurs, or is it B, false? And I won't give the answer right now. I'll give it at the end of this section, but I want to see sort of what your guesses are or what you think is the answer. Okay, I'm seeing some B's here. Okay, let's see if we were right at the end here. All right, so a traditional DevOps strategy, when we think about DevOps, right, in MuleSoft, looks sort of like this, right? You design that API, you develop it using Anypoint Studio, and then you make sure you publish that to Exchange to make it discoverable. And then you make sure that you have it in your Bitbucket or a source code management. And finally, you're using something like Jenkins or GitLab to actually build that artifact, publishing the artifact to an artifact repository, and then deploying it to the correct runtime and correct environment. And a show of hands, just give me a thumbs up or okay. How many people are used to seeing this as the traditional DevOps strategy, or you're familiar with this? Okay, I mean, it could be that some are not familiar with this process. This is sort of what we think about when we want to deploy an application to runtime. So I won't be diving into this process in depth. I will be talking about how we can actually build on top of this traditional process and build a new DevOps strategy when we incorporate API Manager into the mix. So yeah, this is definitely for applications, okay? So if we think about how we can incorporate this traditional DevOps strategy, and we want to now incorporate the API Manager piece, it's gonna look something like this, right? So this part right here is your automation server. So now instead of building that app, right, that artifact that you need to deploy and also publishing to the artifact repository, you're now either creating that API instance for needs of promotion to QA and prod, or you're updating, let's say, a policy that needs to be updated in QA and prod. Of course, dev is here, but I want to focus on QA and prod because these are the two environments that you do not have access to. So this is going to be hitting the API Manager, platform APIs, and then you're able to make the changes reflected in the appropriate environment here. That would give you what's called an API instance ID. And again, this is just high level diagram. We'll kind of dig in deeper later on in this presentation, but I just want to give you an overall view of how this looks like when we think about the new DevOps strategy. So I'll stop here. I have room for 2 questions. If anyone has any, go ahead and ask those now. Okay, if not, oh, okay, I hear a mic.
No, just continue. This was me. So we'll monitor the chat in a bit if there's any question, but so far there's no.
Okay,
Oh,
yeah, so
there
I
is
do
one.
see,
Yep.
yeah, I do see one. What is the difference between create and build? Okay, yeah, that's a great question. So the build is focusing more on when you deploy an application, right? So when you're deploying an app, it's using that traditional DevOps strategy. So you're building an artifact here. And this is only, you will probably only be familiar with this process if you're actually publishing to an artifact repository. It could be that you're manually building this maybe through your studio and then deploying. But if you already have a DevOps strategy in place, you would need to build this in something like Jenkins or GitLab. And then once you build that, you would need to publish it to an artifact repository in order to have versioning and promotion going on when we talk about runtime deployments. The create is a little different because this is introducing the API manager aspect, right? So I call this create and update instead of build because really what you're doing is that you're accessing the API manager UI API. So you're creating the instance the same way you would do, let's say, an API manager. So the same functionality you would have when you, and I will have to log in here shortly. I'll log in. I'll show you in the demo how to do this, but I just want to make sure I'm answering your question. This part has to do with API Manager, where you're creating that instance like you would through the UI, and you're updating. Like, let's say you need to make an update to your policy through the UI. This is this aspect right here. Hopefully that's helpful and I answered that question for you. Okay. I'll keep going now for the next slide here. Okay, so for the people that said false, that's correct. The answer is false, and we can see that here, right? When you do an update to a policy, it's going to QA and prod. Let's say you're making an update to the QA environment. It doesn't require redeployment of your app. And the reason for that is because it's just reading that change. So there's no redeployment that's needed if you're updating API instance. So good job for those that got it right. Okay, so now we're sort of going to go into like the development a little deeper here. I'll talk about the two options that are available for us, as well as how to prepare for one of those options. But another pop quiz here. And this is a hard one, I would have to admit, unless you're used to doing automation through API Manager. Where in the any point platform UI can you export an API's metadata? And when I say metadata, I mean basically everything that is in that API instance UI, like the policies, the endpoint URL. Where can you do that for quick automation setup and promotion of an API instance? And I'll let you sort of read through some of the answers here. And then once you're ready, go ahead and put that in the chat for me. Okay, I'm seeing some A's, some D's, some C's. This one's, I'm not seeing any B's. Okay, well, I'll sort of explain the answer later at the end of this section, and I'll explain through the platform where to actually get that metadata. Okay, so there's two options, as I mentioned. Option number one is through that metadata, through that export JSON file. And what this option will allow you to do is it will allow you to promote to a higher environment. So let's say that you have a API instance in dev, and you want the same API instance components, policies to be in QA, but you don't have access to QA. Option number one is a good way to sort of get the ball rolling and get that to the environment ASAP. The pro of doing it this way is that it's easier to implement and get started because everything is being pulled down, including the policies. The con in the beginning is that it isn't flexible. It doesn't allow you to update right away. The update functionality is something that you will have to add later. And we'll take a look at the APIs and why that is when we talk about the API export JSON option. Option number two is that you can create an API instance using individual APIs. So these are the platform APIs that I'll go into more during our demo. And option number two is really good if you have a good developer team. So you have great developers that can develop Python or Java, and they're willing to commit some time to make the automation more flexible. So the pro about this is that it's more flexible for changes. You're able to update. The con is that it's going to take more time to do, and it involves more custom coding. If I had to pick between the two, and what I would say is a little more agile, is I would pick number one because you can start right away and then later add the custom coding as you're getting started when you think about promoting to QA and prod and having that API instance in these environments where you don't have access through the UI. So I'll pause this because I know this can be a little confusing. So I want to leave room for 2 questions to make sure that this is clear for everyone. So any questions? And you can post them on the chat and I'll pick 2 to answer. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions coming through. Which option needs 0 coding? Unfortunately, there has to be a little bit of coding involved. But if you really want to start out with minimum coding, I would say use that export JSON. And then later on, you can work with, a developer or someone that can extend the flexibility a little bit. Okay. So like I mentioned, I kind of like number 1 because it is easier to implement. There's just a little bit of coding involved. But again, the con is that eventually you will have to add more coding to this in order to make it flexible. So for my example, we're going to actually focus on number 1 and what we need to get option number 1 working. Okay, so the first step that we need to do is actually export that API, right? And the way that you do that is, let me quickly log in here. Give me just a second. In the meantime, if you have any questions, again, please feel free to put your questions via the chat, and then I can do my best to answer those for you. Okay, so step 1 in preparing for this API manager automation, we need to export the API, right? So the way that you do that is, let's go to the home page because I just want to show you the whole process. So you will be going to API manager. We're in dev because we don't have access to pre-prod or prod right now. So let's say you created one API instance, it's already here. So you want to click at that API instance that you want to, promote to either pre-prod or prod. So you click on that. It's going to be under settings. And then here is a button called actions. This is where you're going to export your API. And let's take a look at what's in this instance. So right now we have one policy. We don't have any SLA tiers. We don't have any contracts. So when we take a look at this zip file, if we open it, we should see all this information here. It's a Mule4 app, basic endpoint. Doesn't really have an implementation URL, but usually we should include that. Again, this is just an example. So let's open this zip just to see how that JSON looks like. So this is how the JSON looks like. Should have all the same values that we saw in the UI. So it has an instance label. We knew this is Mule4. And here we see that it also includes that policy. Or sorry, this is the wrong one, I think. Yeah, let me open that again because I think this is the wrong one. Let's try that again. This is the one we downloaded. Let's see. Okay, here we go. make it pretty. Okay, yeah. So the policies here, and it should be cores, right? And if we go back to the policy, we should see that it only has that cores policy here. So like I said, it just brings down all of this and puts it into zip. So that's the first step. We need to make sure we're able to get that. And then the next step is there is what's called an API definition template that we need as well to make this automation successful. And the way that that automation or definition template looks like is it looks something like this. So it's a little bit simple. This will always be the same. The only thing that would change are like the values here. And so if you want to make an update, you can actually change this to yes. And you can have your code read this as a flag. And then you can change the instance label. So if this was dev, for instance, we can change this to QA, go into QA, and we can change these URIs to QA since we're looking to basically create this instance and promote to QA. Okay. Step 3 is to make the necessary updates. So for instance, if the endpoint that you're using needs to be different from the dev, you can't really use the implementation URL that's separate dev, right? You need to make those changes in that JSON. And then those two JSONs, this one that you got in step 1 and this one that you got in step 2, once you have made those changes for the higher environment, you want to make sure that you're saving it and checking it into your code source because you're going to need it to run it through your Jenkins or your automation server. So these are the steps that are needed with option number 1. Okay, so like I said, this was a more challenging question. How many of you actually selected C?
One.
Oh, I see one question from Roberto. Let's see. Can the API instance creation be automated as well? Yes, it could be automated. And we'll see how that works. One thing I would say is that the easiest way to actually create that. So for instance, I'll give you an example. Let's say that we want to create another API instance that's similar to this one. The easiest way is actually to get the export JSON. But if you just want to simply just create an API instance, we can use an individual API. And I'll show you what that API looks like, that platform API looks like when I go through the demo. But the answer is yes for Roberto. You can create an API instance, and that could be automated as well. Okay, so it looks like we have, one person or maybe a few that actually got C right. I would actually recommend that you explore that option, and then I'll show you which API call you need to make to be able to actually create and also promote to higher environments using the export JSON. Here's another example of how those two files look like. When you save this in your code source, or let's say Bitbucket or GitHub, you want to make sure you're saving it as a JSON. And then your automation server should be converting it into zip before it actually makes that API call. And again, we can take a look at Postman to see what I mean when I say that it needs to be a zip. But you should not be checking it into your source code manager as a zip. You want to make sure it's a JSON. Okay. So the next part that I want to talk about is for those that have worked with a server automation like Jenkins or GitLab, I kind of want to show you how this would look like in the sense of CICD pipelines. So how many of you, just a thumbs up or okay or yes, how many of you have actually worked with like a server automation like Jenkins or GitLab or something like that? And then if you haven't, just give me a thumbs down or no. Okay, so a lot of you have actually worked with this. So you kind of understand how, you can set pipelines and jobs. So for the next section here, we'll just talk about how that's going to look like when you set it up using Jenkins or GitLab or some sort of automation server. But before that, we have another question. I think this is, we gave the answer previously, but what component is needed to pair a deployed application to an API created on the platform? So basically, you're trying to pair your API instance to a deployed application. What do you need in order to make that available or make that happen? Okay, I'm seeing a lot of A's. Okay. Like I said, there was a lot of clues in the beginning. So hopefully I am seeing a lot of A's, which is a good sign. Okay, so when we think about how to actually configure our pipelines, especially if we're trying to incorporate API Manager into the mix, we need to understand how to actually configure your deployment pipeline, which for many of you, you might be already familiar with this. It sort of reflects the traditional DevOps strategy slide that I displayed earlier. But what you want to do is make sure that you have a job, right, that's doing the building. And once that build is successful, you're publishing that to an artifact repository. And the reason for this is so that you can have rollback functionality, right? Let's say you want to go back to a different version because for some reason this isn't the right, there's something in the app that didn't work. You want to make sure that you're publishing it to a repository with that versioning in order to be able to do that. So this is job one. And usually this is done by using what's called a Maven command. And I won't get into exactly what this is, but I just want to see how many of you understand when I say Maven command. And just give me a thumbs up if you know what that means, like a Maven command or running a Maven. Okay. So that would be the first job, right? The second job is to actually retrieve that artifact from your artifact repository. And then the next thing that you want to do is deploy that runtime into the runtime using an API instance ID. So this is your discovery ID. And this is going to be coming from this creation update pipeline, which is really just the automation of API Manager, this process right here. So in order to do job two, we actually need to send this API instance ID externally. So now it should be a parameter that you're including in your Maven command. Instead of actually having it in a properties file, like a dev properties file, we want to make sure it's externalized and you're including it in your Maven command externally as a parameter. And again, I won't go in deep depth into this, but if you do have questions, we can talk about it at the end, or I'll have my email at the end that you can send me to talk more about the deployment pipeline. But I really want to focus on the API Manager side here. So now that you're sort of deploying your application through this traditional model here with this small change of externalizing your API instance ID, we need to make sure that we have the automation in place for API Manager. And the job that you would need, you really only need one, right? You need a create and update API instance. And you can run this either using a custom Maven plugin. Let's say that you have a developer that actually developed in Java and created a custom Maven plugin, or you can use a script, either a Python script or something that does an orchestration of API calls. And the result should always be an API instance. Even if that API instance exists, you should always have that returned. And like I mentioned in the beginning, if you're using that API definition, if the update is no, then it will simply just bring back that API instance ID if it already exists, right? If it already exists, it's not going to do anything. And we'll look at that automation flow later in this presentation. Any questions in how to think about configuring your server automation? And feel free to put that in the chat if you have any questions. Okay. So yes, most of you got it right. In order to pair a deployed application, we need to make sure that we have that API instance ID. And I think most of you probably know the API instance ID is right here under your API instance, under API Manager. Okay, so now that we sort of have that big picture of how we need to configure our server and what is needed to actually start our development prep, let's talk about what platform APIs are needed. But before we do that, even if you haven't automated this, I hope that you can guess the correct answer here. But what API call do you make first as part of automating the API Manager UI? Go ahead and put that in the chat for me. Okay, and then as always, we'll find out what the answer is at the end of this section. Okay, so these are the functionalities that we need to include when we think about automation, right? We need to be able to create an instance. We need to be able to update an instance. And same thing goes for a policy. We need to be able to create a policy, update a policy, create and update SLA tiers. So these are the main functionality to really have true automation of the API Manager and incorporate that into our DevOps strategy. This is an example of what the flow looks like, right? This is the automation flow diagram when we think about what platform APIs we need. So the first thing we need, and we're going to need a token for each call, right? So we need to be able to retrieve a token. And this can be done either through client credentials or your user credentials, which for the demo today, we're going to look at using a user credential to get the token. And from there, you're going to need a token for each call after that. So you can do a API call for retrieving an org ID or environment ID, although I will argue that you don't really need to do API calls for these. And the reason for that is because the org ID never changes. Same thing with your environment ID. And I'll show you what that means. If you go to, let's say, your instance, you might have noticed this URL up here. Right after organizations, this part is actually your org ID. And your org ID is reflected or linked to what your business group is here, right? So this is the ID, the org ID. The environment ID is also here. You can find it here, and this is linked to your dev. If we went to pre-prod, we can see that the org ID will be the same, but the environment ID is going to be different. So we have B1, C2. Let's check out how that looks like for QA here, pre-prod. So we have B1, right? Because it's linked to this org right here. But the environment ID is different because now we're in pre-prod instead of dev. So that's a quick way to find what those are. You can also go to Access Manager and find it through here, but this is really quick to be able to find out what your org ID is and what your environment ID is. So if we go back here, you could make an API call for these, but I would actually save this under a key value and use it as a parameter for your automation server. That's the way that I've seen it done. But again, you have options because we have the APIs to be able to do that as well. The next step is that we're going to search for an API to see if it already exists in API Manager. If it doesn't, it will create a new API instance. If it does, and that flag that I stated here is yes, then it's going to do an update. And then if that flag is set to no, and that API instance does exist, there's no change that's going to happen. And there's different ways of doing this in order to actually compare and see if it actually exists. What I usually use is the API instance label. So you want to make sure that this label is unique. So if I do a search on the label, and you'll see when I talk about this during the demo, if it can't find that, then it'll create a new API instance. If it does, and no update is needed, no change. If update is flagged to true or yes, then this goes through. And then it's the same for the policies and same for the SLA. And since we're going to be sharing these slides, I kind of wrote down the steps of that just to make sure you can go back and kind of review what those steps are here. Okay. Let's see what the answer was here. So yeah, it's B. We need that access token first, right? Because in order to make the API calls, we need to pass that token along. All right, so I'm going to pause here to see if there are any additional questions. Manish, thank you for answering that. But do we have any questions before I dive into the demo here? And as I do the demo, feel free to ask questions. Because I want to make sure we have folks answering, or I can answer if I see that question on the chat here. Okay, so let's go to Postman. All right, so first of all, I'll see if I can share these Postman collections with you so that you can have it handy and play around with some of these calls. But another place that you can actually go to that's available for you is you can go to this developer portal here. I will put this in the chat so you can take a look. Okay. And here you have APIs for basically all parts of the Anypoint platform. But the one that we want to look at is actually the API manager APIs here. And here you have, like I mentioned, a few of them where you can get APIs, you can post API, and this is how the body looks like. So I think I forgot who it was, but someone asked, can we create an API? We can do that even without the export JSON, and this is how you do it here. So it kind of gives you a good idea of what's needed for the request and then how the response will look like. So I took those and I just created sort of a Postman collection for that. So go ahead and take a look. And if you want to follow along with me, if you already have a login and you can log into your Anyport platform, and there's an instance that you can use to play along, go ahead and follow along with me and then ask me any questions if you have any along the way. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is we want to be able to get a token, right? And a lot of these I parameterize using the environments here. You can do it that way too, or you can add the value here. But you're going to have the key, which is the username, and then your username, as well as the password and the password. And this is going into body as this selection right here. And this is how the endpoint looks like. Let me see if I can actually post this in the chat. Okay, so let's make this call. This is going to give us a token. And actually, if you get this invalid CSRF token in Postman, it's because you have these cookies here that you need to delete. So just go ahead and delete those. And now we have this token. So here's your token, right? You want to grab that, because the next call we're going to do is actually, we're going to create an API from an export JSON. And the way that this works is that we're going to take a zip file and actually use a zip file to do that. So let's go to our platform here. Let's get that zip file again. So I'm going to just export that. And then you're going to see here under the parameters that you have to insert your org ID and your environment ID. So right now, I think this is pointed to QA. So this is going to actually be created in QA. But it should take exactly what we have in dev and put it in QA. So let's look to make sure nothing is in pre-prod. Nope. Okay. So now I'm going to go ahead back to the body. I'm going to look for the one that I just downloaded. I think it might be this one. Yep. Or this one. Okay. So now I can put it here as the value, and then you want to create an instance label, because again, we're going to use this instance label to sort of determine if we need to create another API instance. So we can give it an instance label. I gave it QA here. And now if we look at the token, I'm already passing the token, and the reason for that is because I'm actually parsing it. But you can go ahead and paste your token here. Okay, so this is how the call looks like. You need organization, your organization ID, environments, your environment ID, and then /APIs. So let's go ahead and make that call. Okay, so it looks like it got created. So I should see this in my platform, right? So if I go here and do a refresh, should be able to see that. So here it is, and that is the instance label name that I gave it that we inserted here. And I also should have that one policy that dev had as well, which is that CORS policy. Okay, so now let's look at another use case. Let's say that for some reason, QA needs a JWT validation, right? So we need to make an update to QA. Because right now we only have one policy, cores, but they're demanding that we also include a JWT validation here. You can do this by making this call. And again, this API endpoint, you can find it under that link that I sent you. But what's needed is you need your org ID again, which again is your business group, this environment ID, which right now is pointed to QA, and then you need your API ID. And your API ID should be in that response that you created. So this is your API ID. It should be your discovery API instance ID. So like I mentioned, I am parsing that out already. So when I make this call, it should update my instance, and we should see the JWT validation here. So let's take a look. Okay, looks like it created. And again, I'm still passing that token. That's why that worked. So I'm going to refresh this. And there's our JWT validation. Okay, now they're asking you that they want to add an SLA tier because we don't have one. That's another API call, and that's a post call here. And the body's going to look like this. Again, if you want to retrieve your list of policies, there is a get that you can do to retrieve which policies you can use to actually update, as well as you can retrieve SLA tiers and then add it as the request here. So we want to add a SLA tier, and the process is similar where you're including, again, your API ID, environment ID, and API ID as part of your path here. And then this is /tiers as the endpoint. So let's give that a try. Let's see. It's created. We should see it here now. There we go. So there are definitely more platform APIs that we can look at, but I just kind of wanted to give you an idea of how you can use Postman to do this. Any questions so far? Go ahead and put the questions that you have in the chat. The next thing, I'm going to show you just a quick script, right? And the script is just going to kind of go through how to actually promote. It doesn't have any update functionality, but I just want to show you how you can actually incorporate this in your server, right? Oh, I do see, how can we migrate an API with contracts? So that one is a tricky one. This is why I say that you do need a good developer on hand, because you're going to have to save that contract somewhere, right? And then do like a post contract for that API that you're trying to migrate. I'll have my email at the end there, Aron. Go ahead and send me that, and I can send you more info. But I would say it does involve some orchestration, but it is able. You can migrate an API with contracts. Okay. So I want to give a short way, and this is just a bash script. Again, using Python, something that's more flexible because bash doesn't allow you to parse. But I want to let you kind of see how you can actually automate and orchestrate different API calls. And this is just an example of how I did that. These are the arguments here, which are keys, right? And these are the values. And you're just going to run it like this by index. And I'll show you how to do that. So right here, I'm going to actually migrate this to prod now, right? We have it in QA. I'm going to promote this to prod using this script. Give me a second here because I want to make sure I have the right script. So first thing I'm going to do is paste these arguments. Okay, so I have the necessary arguments. It's going to run the script. And then it's going to be created in prod. But unfortunately, I forgot to change that instance label to prod. So it's going to say this in dev. And then I'll dive deeper into how that script looks like. And maybe it'll give you an idea of how to actually create your own script, like a Python script or even a custom Maven plugin using Java. So let's go to prod and see if we see anything in prod. And we do. And of course, it still has that dev here because I forgot to change it. And the way this script works is, again, this is just a shell. I'm using, those different parameters that I'm passing. And then it's making that access token call first, right? Because we need that, and then passing it to each call after that. There's like if else conditions there. One which looks at the instance label to see if it exists. So for example, what will happen if I run this again, right? Because this already exists. It should not create an instance label. It should just find it and give me the auto ID. So let's see what happens if I run it again, knowing that we already have this in prod. So it found it, right? It says, I found this. We don't need to do anything. It ends the actual script. So that's sort of the way that you need to think about it when you think about orchestrating these APIs. Make sure that you have the conditions that are needed for that. And then I have the functions here, which have the different components where you're logging, getting instance, creating instance. I tried to finish the update, but I actually don't have it completed for this because of the limitation with parsing. But if you use something like Python, you can parse the policies out of your export JSON and then make sure that it's formatted correctly and then pass it to do an update the way that we did using Postman. I wanted to see actually if, let's take a look. Actually, I'm still stuck on the contract question because I really do want to answer that. But in the meantime, any questions regarding how we can actually automate this and use our platform APIs to do an orchestration to be able to do a script or a Python script? Any questions on that? If so, go ahead and put that in the chat for me. Okay, so this is what I would say about contracts here. I actually just saw it. Okay, so yeah, you can get the contract for that specific API or API instance. And then it just takes like parsing out the necessary component to be able to do like a either patch call to that specific API ID or whatever you're trying to migrate to QA. So I would suggest looking at these API calls here and seeing if those are any help. If not, again, you can always reach out to me and I can help you there. Awesome. So here are my information. Please feel free to add me on LinkedIn. This is my MuleSoft email. If you have any questions, go ahead and shoot me some there. But for now, I'm going to just give some space for questions that you might have. Thanks again for taking the time out of your evening to listen to how we can automate API Manager. And I hope this was helpful for all of you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much, Annabelle.
Yeah, thanks for this presentation, Annabelle.
Yeah, of course. I am seeing a question here. And thank you, Manish, for that. Yeah, definitely automating contract if it has an SLA is not best practice. So thanks for responding to that. What if you need an approval process before? An approval process before promoting should be done. So the way that I've seen it done is that you should have a CRQ process in place with your DevOps person, right? And that is something that you can sort of, there's different ways of going about that, but I would strongly suggest a CRQ process. So this is where, you are good to go for deployment to QA. You should not be able to just go ahead and make that creation or update yourself. If you're the developer, you need to have someone else that sort of approves that and have them actually or go through like a approval process before you can do that. So that is more of how you configure your automation server. So you would do that process more related to that server automation. I don't know if Manish or someone else has a different way, but that's how I've seen it done.
Yeah, and another thing is I would like to, on top of that, what you shared, there is another link is there. I would like to share over here, which is there is an API you can call for your deployment. It will help you to automation of your deployment. So this is all API for the deployment of your application.
Oh, yeah. Yep. If you want to, there's APIs for the actual, application deployment as well. You should be able to find a lot of helpful APIs in that link that I provided. Thank you for providing that. That's good. Okay, any other questions? How many of you think that you would kind of are now excited to explore these APIs? And yes, we will be sharing the Postman collection. And Roberto, for the Maven plugin planned for API Manager automation, I haven't heard of that. Right now, the way that I've seen is folks are building their own custom Maven, but that's a great idea, creating one. Okay. Great. I don't see any more questions going through. So thank you, everyone, again.
Thank you so much, Annabelle.
Thanks.
It was a great presentation. And I'm going to stop the recording, but Rajneesh, if you have any insights, any closing comments, please.
Yeah, thanks for everyone. I don't have